Well, I know that when I first got my driver's license, I drove a little too fast sometimes. And I had this big lifted truck that I paid for. I had a lawn cutting business. And so I actually made like a lot of money during the summer, made a couple $1,000 a month. And I got this truck for off roading, and it was probably not the safest thing to drive fast. And I was late for a baseball game, and I was doing like 97 miles an hour in a
Oh,
55-mile-an-hour zone, and got pulled over. And the cop was a total jerk. I was speeding, but he wrote me a ticket for speeding for like dangerously changing lanes, and I was on like this country highway with no one. I hadn't changed lanes in like miles and miles and miles. When he asked me for my license and registration, I unclicked my seatbelt to get it. He wrote me up for not wearing a seatbelt. um, he just like threw the book at me in every way, shape, or form, and I was screwed. There was nothing I could do. I was going to get my license taken once it all went down, and so I got home. I wouldn't play the baseball game. I drove home. I had to tell my parents. They were pissed, and I was just like, there's nothing I could do about it. I was going to get in so much trouble. And the next day I got home from school, and my dad was like, you are not going to believe it, but you got out of your ticket completely. And I was like, what? And it just so happened my dad worked with this guy whose brother was the judge in the county where I got the ticket that was like 2 hours away from where I lived, in this like little podunk county in the middle of nowhere, Kentucky. And I just was like the luckiest thing ever. There's nothing I could do to help myself. I was just a big old ball of helpless need, and I got totally saved, and it was epic. I will never forget that. Um, and there's a story in the Bible where Jesus does this same thing. There's this woman who is just a big old ball of need, and there's nothing she can do. And Jesus hooks her up and helps her. And so I'm going to read you this story out of Mark 5. It's chapters 24 through 34. And it starts out by saying, um, so Jesus went, and a large crowd followed and pressed around him. And of course, basically, anytime at this point Jesus went anywhere, mad people were following him. He had done all these miracles. He was like way more famous than Justin Bieber. He was like the biggest thing. And so people just followed him no matter where he was. And they would like crowd around him. Like Jesus had an entourage, like just like couldn't walk basically everywhere he went. And of course, this is what's going on. And not to mention, he had just come from this ridiculous miracle where he cast a demon out of this person, and that was crazy. So everyone saw that, like added onto the crowd. Um, and then this super famous rich guy came up and was like, my kid's dying. And Jesus like, oh, I'll come. I'll raise it from the dead. I'll come with you. And so everyone that heard about that was coming, and they wanted to see it. So he had like a massive crowd with him. And it says, and a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. Let's just take a moment and pause there and let that sink in. This woman had been bleeding for 12 years. That's crazy. I don't know what her injury was. I don't know where she was bleeding, but can any of you imagine what it would be like to bleed for 12 straight years? Because I certainly can't. Um, it would not be good. So, anyways, there's this woman bleeding for 12 years. Not a good situation. And it says she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she only grew worse. So she had given her entire life savings. She was in debt, probably gone to see every doctor you could imagine, and nothing helped. And in fact, she only got worse. So this woman was desperate, sad. It was not good. Um, and not to mention, back in those days, if you bled, like blood made you unclean. So anyone that had blood on them, nobody would want to touch them. No one would want to be around them. You would have to do this like ceremonial cleaning. You'd have to stay away from people. If you were bleeding and you touched someone, they'd be super pissed because then they would have to go out and get clean. And it was this huge hassle. So imagine for 12 years, this woman probably had like no friends. She had not hugged or anybody or held hands with anybody or hung out with anybody. Like she was like in a horribly sad way. So this woman was not in a good spot. And it says when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touched his clothes, I would be healed. And let's just think about how crazy that is. So we know that if anyone touched her, they'd be pissed because they'd have to go get ceremonially clean. And we know this crowd around Jesus was crazy packed. So can you imagine how scary it'd be for this woman to squeeze through this crowd to get to Jesus and touch him? Because if I'm imagining she had like a hood up and gloves on, like, so no one would recognize her, but everyone she touched would be pissed if it knew it was her. And then she's touching Jesus, who, if she touches him, she makes him ceremonially unclean. So she's risking making him pissed. And so she's like, but I know that he's healing everybody. So imagine the faith that she has to trust that Jesus is going to heal her instead of being pissed. And so what do you guys think Jesus' response is going to be? He's going to be like, oh my gosh, you made me unclean. Now I'm so angry. Let's see. It says, immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. Whoop, whoop. And at once, Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, who touched my clothes? Can you imagine how nervous she was at that moment? She was like, oh, busted. Like, but also like, I'm healed, but I'm busted. I'm healed. I'm in so much trouble. Like, Jesus just like scolding you basically. Like, is that what he's doing? Kind of feels that way at the moment. And his best friends are there and they're like, what are you talking about? Like, there's a million people. What do you mean, who touched me? How, like, everybody's touching you. But Jesus kept looking around to see who had done it. And then the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at the feet of Jesus, so afraid, trembling with fear, and told him the whole truth, which is super brave. Like, this woman's been through a lot. She is super brave because like the crowd could have just mobbed on her and like it could have been a bad situation, but she was honest. And so that's pretty rad. And so what is Jesus's response? He says, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. And in another place, it also says that Jesus stopped and listened to her whole story. And we know he's in a hurry because he's on his way to like raise somebody from the dead. So Jesus's response is nothing but loving, compassionate. He cares about this woman. And it's pretty remarkable because in that one statement, he calls her daughter. And he says, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from suffering. And so in that one statement, he fixes everything about this girl's life. He calls her daughter, which is like, you were an outcast. Now you're in the family. You're on the inside. And he says, your faith has healed you. So you're healed. You're not bleeding anymore. So no one has to worry about touching you and being ceremonially unclean, and be free of your suffering. So basically Jesus just like brings her back into normal life in every way, shape, or form in one interaction. And it's like the most amazing thing. This woman goes from the most ridiculous ball of need, just like I was, to just totally hooked up, freed, healthy, healed, amazing. And this story is so encouraging and it's so amazing because Jesus wants to do the same thing in your life. We are all big old balls of helpless need. And Jesus wants to step in and in every way, shape, or form, heal it, fix it, make it right, hook you up with the best, most perfect imaginable life you could ever have, the life that he created you for, a life to be perfectly in relationship with God. And we